Striking in MMA is one of the most varied and unpredictable things in combat sports, and it comes in so many shapes and sizes. Certain strikers are very calculated, measured, technical, and do everything by the book, whereas others just look like they're doing whatever they want. So today I'm going to go through some of the most unpredictable and unorthodox strikers in MMA and explain why they're so successful. The first fighter we're going to talk about is Michael Page, also known as MVP. MVP has been in the game for such a long time, and he's always been one of the most fun to watch showmen in the sport. MVP has such a unique and distinctive style of striking. The jumping up and down bouncing karate stance is one that's rarely seen in MMA, mainly because it's incredibly hard to pull off correctly. MVP's game seems entirely built around the idea of being unpredictable, and also trying to make his opponents come to him first. One strength about MVP is that it's impossible to guess what strike he's going to throw next. Whether it's a wide punch, straight punch, knee, kick, elbow, whatever, he always stands just outside striking range because he knows he can close the distance faster than his opponents can. You can argue that his defense is flawed. One well-timed leg kick from Douglas Lima led to him being knocked out, but he found in the rematch with Lima that simply not being overconfident would lead to a victory. He'd drop Lima twice in the rematch, but he'd almost suffer the exact same fate as the first fight after a leg kick from Lima, missing the repeat knockout by a few inches. MVP spent the majority of his career in Bellator, and people criticised him for his lack of quality opposition. He eventually made the jump to the UFC, taking on Kevin Holland in March, and he proved that his striking doesn't just work against Bellator fighters. The showboating and taunting is an important aspect to MVP striking, as it baits his opponents to come to him, which is what he wants, since he's at his best as a counterpuncher, which is attributed to his incredible reflexes on the feet. Unfortunately, his style and the way he stands as a fighter doesn't favour wrestling. Since he stands straight up and his feet are always bouncing, he doesn't have a base to defend takedowns from, which has led to some losses in his career, including his most recent fight versus Ian Garry. Moving on to a second contender for most unorthodox striker in MMA, Jiri Prochazka. As soon as Jiri signed to the UFC in 2020, he was an instant fan favourite. People loved his wild, unpredictable and crazy style, as he displayed in his debut versus Volkan Oezdemir. While MVP stays out of danger mostly by keeping distance and bouncing on his toes, Jiri stands straight in front of his opponents, with his hands down. Any coach will tell you that's the worst thing you can possibly do. But since Jiri has a granite chin, he makes it work, since Jiri's effectiveness comes from how overwhelming he is. Jiri throws from such unorthodox angles, usually darting into range and throwing punches from the hip, which none of his opponents are used to. He won by knockout in round 2 in his debut, and his second fight would be booked against Dominic Reyes. Reyes was known as a powerful counterpuncher southpaw, so stylistically, this was a difficult fight for Jiri. Normally, against a counterpuncher, the approach should be to fight more measured and reserved, being aware of the opponent's timing. But Jiri took the exact opposite approach. He chose to simply overwhelm Reyes, to the point where Reyes simply can't land his counters because he's getting beaten up. Jiri also carries a lot of power in his punches, which would lead to his opponents being more hesitant, knowing how much Jiri can hurt if he lands correctly. Jiri spent the entire first round bullying and chasing Reyes around the cage. His plan was simply to wear Reyes down by force, making Reyes constantly move and invest into the body, so that he could eventually pin Reyes against the cage and knock him out, which he would do with a spinning elbow. With only 2 fights in the UFC, Jiri then got a title shot versus the current champion Glover Teixeira. Glover was mainly a grappler, and Glover, much like Jiri, has incredible powers of recovery. Glover would succeed in most takedown attempts, but Jiri would somehow find his way back to his feet every time. And while the fight was on the feet, the fight was entirely one-sided, as he'd back Glover against the cage every time, and Glover would somehow not go down to any of those massive strikes Jiri was landing. The fight would be a constant, repeating cycle. Jiri would batter Glover on the feet, but Glover would somehow weasel his way out of it through takedowns. Jiri is one of the most fearless fighters on the roster, so whenever he got the chance, he would completely let his hands go versus Glover. He was constantly thinking of new ways to knock out Glover, including body shots, knees. He even learned from early on and started to keep his distance a bit. But Glover would somehow, somewhere, always find a way to get a takedown. Going into round 5, they were tied on the scorecards, 2-2. And at the start of round 5, Glover landed a massive right hand. He made the mistake of pulling a guillotine and allowed Jiri to recover. But even then, Jiri was losing the round, and it was looking like a Glover decision victory. But Jiri kept scrambling on the ground and eventually found his way under the chin with a rear naked choke, with 30 seconds left of the fight. And that made Jiri the new light heavyweight champion of the UFC. He wasn't done any favours in his first title defence, as he'd be matched with former middleweight champion Alex Pereira. There comes a point where eventually, someone with a style like Jiri's simply runs into someone who's too good. Jiri did well in round 2, but eventually he'd pay for his over-aggressiveness and his low hands, getting knocked out by a left hook, as Pereira followed up and got the knockout, which made Pereira the new light heavyweight champion. Jiri would bounce back the following year at UFC 300 against Alexander Rakic. Rakic is an extremely technically sound striker, and in the first round he was piecing up Jiri, landing massive right hands, counter hooks, body kicks, leg kicks, head kicks. It wasn't looking good for Jiri early on, but it seems like Jiri always goes through adversity to win a fight. Jiri would eventually catch Rakic by simply wearing him out. The more Rakic threw, the slower he became, and Jiri would eventually find the knockout in the second round, making it another comeback victory. But like I said before, there's always someone who's simply better, as he'd rematch Alex Pereira that same year, being knocked down by a left hook in round 1 and then knocked out by a head kick at the start of round 2. That was Jiri's most recent fight, and he's now booked for a fight versus former champion Jamal Hill in January. The next fighter we're going to talk about is usually who comes to mind when the word unorthodox is mentioned: Tony El Cucuy Ferguson. When Ferguson's brought up nowadays, what comes to mind usually is the massive downward spiral he's been on. But it's easy to forget just how good Tony was at one point. Going back to the days of his 13-fight win streak, Tony was someone that no one wanted to face. Tony was also a very weird fighter to be against, as he does a lot of things that simply don't make any sense, either inside or outside the cage. Whether it's throwing punches to the leg or doing forward rolls, Tony probably is the weirdest fighter of all time. His best performance, in my opinion, was versus Edson Barboza. This game plan was very similar to the one that Jiri had for Dominic Reyes. Edson Barboza had a Muay Thai base, and he was a very technical striker. Prime Edson Barboza was known as one of the best strikers in the UFC at the time, and Barboza was best known for his kicks. So Tony actually had a very smart game plan here. He gave Barboza no space at all to land those kicks. Tony made sure he was always chasing to make sure he was in punching range, and whether that meant him getting punched in the face did not matter, as he knew Barboza would break before he did. Tony started to show his creativity more and more as the fight went on, throwing elbows and other punches from weird angles to overwhelm Barboza more than he already was. He'd cut open Barboza with a lead elbow, leaving his face a bloody mess, and he'd continue to pile on the pressure, until eventually Barboza shot a panic takedown, which led to Tony latching up a Darce choke, which submitted Barboza in round 2. The issue with Tony's style is the same as Prochazka's. His lack of defence leads to him taking massive shots in every single fight. The worst case being against Lando Vannata, who knocks down Ferguson 4 times in the space of 20 seconds. Tony, being Tony, would somehow survive to round 2, and he started to let his hands go on a more gassed Lando Vannata. What a lot of opponents find is that they gas themselves out, punching Tony too many times, as Tony would then get a submission win in round 2. The most impressive win of Tony's career would have to be versus Rafael dos Anjos. Dos Anjos was the lightweight champion just before this fight happened, and just like Tony, Dos Anjos was known for his endurance. So this time Tony catches Homer Simpson his way to a win. Instead, Tony showed actually impressive striking capability. Even though Ferguson does everything wrong technically on the feet, he'd pull off the win in a pure striking match against the former champion. Arguably Tony's most iconic performance took place in the co-main event of Khabib versus McGregor, where he faced Anthony Pettis. He got knocked down at the start of round 2, and as usual, forward rolled his way out of it, and he proceeded to batter Anthony Pettis against the cage for the rest of the round. Similar to the Barboza fight, Pettis was known best for his kicks, as Tony opted to close the distance and not allow Pettis any space. Tony showed off his full arsenal in this fight: body shots, elbows, kicks, everything. He focused on cutting open Pettis with elbows for the entire round. The unfortunate thing about Tony at this point of his career is that this is where he started to slow down. His overly intense and unorthodox training techniques, as well as the injuries and his age in general, had started to catch up on him. Even in this fight versus Pettis, you can see his movement isn't quite the same as it was versus Barboza. even though it was an impressive victory, which he won by stoppage in round 2 after the corner stopped the fight. Eventually, as we saw in Jiri versus Pereira, that weird style doesn't always work on every opponent. Tony started the fight with Justin Gaethje quite well, dropping Gaethje at the end of round 2 with an uppercut. But eventually, Gaethje just started to figure out Tony, as Tony would finally pay for his absolute lack of defence. Tony tried his best in that fight, but Gaethje would clip Tony bad every time he came in. Unlike most of Tony's opponents, Gaethje was prepared for that sort of fight. Gaethje's entire fighting career has been spent in wars, so the intensity of an older, slowed down, injured Tony Ferguson was nothing new for Gaethje, as he'd continued to land massive shots on Tony, to the point where it became hard to watch. Tony's brain could only take one more jab in round 5, before it was clear that he wasn't right, and the ref had to step in. And that began the longest losing streak in UFC history. The final fighter we're going to talk about is middleweight champion Dricus du Plessis. Dricus' style is very hard to explain in terms of how it works. Nothing he throws seems to be done correctly. Unlike Tony and Jiri, with their consistent pressure, Dricus can be easily backed up, but he seems to pull off the win every single time. He has been doubted through the entirety of his UFC career. I think the worst Dricus has ever looked on the feet is in round 2 versus Darren Till. Dricus had gassed himself out in round 1 by punching Till in the face too many times, so Till started to look like he was on the way to a comeback victory. Dricus looks like a fish out of water on the feet, very uncomfortable the entire time, as Darren's left hand would land over and over again. But since Till doesn't know how to stuff a takedown, Dricus took him down and submitted him quite easily in the 3rd round. But the way he looked on the feet made people think he had no chance versus the elites of the division. He then went on to fight Derek Brunson, who's equally as goofy on the feet. Dricus looks as goofy as ever on his way to a knockout victory in round 2 after Brunson gassed himself out. So now a top 5 level fight was up next for Dricus, and most people, including myself, thought Whittaker would have an easy night versus Dricus. But one interesting factor going into the fight is that apparently Dricus has had a nose injury for his entire career that prevented him from breathing properly, and Whittaker was his first opponent since undergoing that surgery. Dricus resembled his normal goofiness, but he seemed a bit more calculated, and that became apparent when he knocks down Whittaker with a jab in round 2 and then finished him off. So with that win, Dricus not only got himself a title shot, but also changed the fans' perception of him as a fighter and a striker. He then fought Sean Strickland, who just dominated Israel Adesanya over 5 rounds. And this is where we saw how intelligent Dricus' striking is. Dricus used his unpredictability to his advantage. Strickland is a very technical but basic striker. He's used to fighting very conventional strikers with understandable rhythm, and Strickland's at his best on the front foot. So Dricus made sure to stay on the front foot and throw very unpredictable strikes. So Dricus fought his way to a close split decision win. Dricus' first title defence would be against Israel Adesanya, who's a completely different style of striker. And I think in this fight we saw Dricus really come into his own as a striker. His charging attacks don't look great technically, but they're very effective in the way that Dricus comes out so fast, along with the massive power that Dricus packs in his punches. It's a very hard attack to defend because his opponents are stuck between 2 places. They can either try to counter, which puts them at risk of getting hit, or simply move backwards, which puts them against the cage, where Dricus works his wrestling. He eventually dropped Adesanya in round 4 with one of those blitzes, and continued to chase him, eventually getting the back, finding the rear naked choke, and submitted Adesanya at the end of round 4. That was Dricus' most recent fight, and he's now booked to face Khamzat Chimaev next in his title defence. And that does it for my video. Like and subscribe, leave a comment. Goodbye.